This is the 1 Million Lives podcast by Laerdal. Listen to healthcare professionals, healthcare educators, and survivors share their best practices and what they've learned from these experiences. At Laerdal, it's our goal to help save 1 million more lives every year by 2030. One life at a time.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the 1 Million Lives podcast. My name is Michael Sauter and I'm your host and editor of this podcast. I'm also the Chief Learning Officer at the company Laerdal Medical. This episode is dedicated to all the hard work done in healthcare to maintain and improve levels of safety and quality for us all as patients, but also for the healthcare providers themselves. In 1999, the Institute of Medicine released a landmark report called "To Err is Human." At the time, it was a groundbreaking report that shed light on the prevalence and impact of medical errors in the United States healthcare system. The report highlighted that medical errors, ranging from misdiagnosis to surgical mistakes, were responsible for significant patient harm and even death, with estimates suggesting tens of thousands, if not 100,000 lives lost annually due to preventable errors. It emphasized the need for systemic change within healthcare institutions to prioritize patient safety through measures such as enhanced communication, error reporting systems, and a culture of transparency and accountability. "To Err is Human" sparked a widespread awareness and prompted concerted efforts to improve patient safety standards and practices across the healthcare industry. It seems reasonable to assume that the status for healthcare quality and safety in the US is probably quite similar to most countries that we would consider high-income countries. 2 decades after the report was released, a 2018 follow-up report was released by David Bates and Hardeep Singh. The report, called 2 Decades Since To Err is Human, an assessment of progress and emerging priorities in patient safety, serves as a comprehensive evaluation of advancements and ongoing challenges in patient safety since the original To Err is Human report. It examines the strides made in reducing medical errors and improving healthcare quality, while also identifying persistent issues and emerging priorities. The assessment acknowledges improvements such as increased awareness, enhanced reporting systems, and the implementation of evidence-based practices. Yet, it underscores continued concerns such as diagnostic errors, disparities in care, and a need for greater interdisciplinary collaboration. Furthermore, the new report highlights new challenges brought about by technological advancements and shifting healthcare delivery models, emphasizing the necessity for continued innovation, research, and system-level changes to ensure patient safety remains a top priority in healthcare. Finally, in a very recent editorial of January 2023 to the New England Journal of Medicine, Professor Don Berwick, the founder of the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, IHI, included that recent findings suggest that the safety movement has, at best, stalled. This may serve as the context and backdrop for inviting Dr. Pierre Barker, the Chief Scientific Officer of the IHI, as a guest to the 1 Million Lives podcast. As I see it, he is uniquely positioned to help us understand some of the issues in this area. I recently had the chance to sit down with him to discuss some of the issues, so without further ado, I give you Dr. Pierre Barker.
Thank you for having me. And my name is Pierre Barker, and I work with the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer there. I got involved in this world kind of unexpectedly for me. I am a pediatrician by background. I qualified in South Africa, did my pediatric training in London, worked in the NHS for nearly 10 years, and went to the United States on a basic science track. I was very interested in fetal lung physiology. That's what took me to the United States. But I continued to work as a clinician in a hospital setting. And during my work, which I was very engaged with. I always loved taking care of patients. I became aware of how inefficient and frustrating it was for me to work as a clinician with all the kind of obstacles that seemed to be unnecessary, that were preventing me from doing what I loved to do. And I started expressing my frustration to my bosses. And they said, okay, well, why don't you show us how to do it then? And I found myself, as often we do as clinicians, in an administrative role as head of the ambulatory services for a big children's hospital in North Carolina and in the States. And quite honestly, I didn't really know what I was doing in that kind of administrative capacity. I came across the work of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which is focused on trying to make systems work better. And I was particularly inspired by a talk that I attended with Don Berwick at one of their large meetings, who laid out a system of thinking that seemed to me to make just common sense about how we could better organize care. And I thought, well, that this is something that I would really love to do. I had subsequently had an opportunity to join some of the work that IHI was offering. And one thing led to another, and I took a sabbatical leave, trained in some of the implementation science methodologies that IHI uses. And I went off to South Africa, back to South Africa at the height of the HIV epidemic. That's where I really applied the methodology for the first time and found it to be very helpful at a population level in trying to help healthcare workers do what they're supposed to do every day, but in a very reliable way and have a really big impact on patient outcomes.
And that is actually a perfect segue into a couple of questions I have related to the status of patient safety and quality improvement globally. And I have to admit that my entry point to this was a slightly different one, although Don Berwick is one of my heroes too. My entry point was really the report from the Institute of Medicine, To Err is Human.
Yeah.
Was published back in 1999. And I think, if I recall it correctly, it was estimated that about 100,000 patients die prematurely or unnecessarily from preventable errors in the US healthcare system annually. And then you shared kindly with me that there had been sort of a retrospective done by David Bates and Hardip Singh in 2018.
Yes.
Where they tried sort of 2 decades later to evaluate, well, have we actually moved the needle since then? And I read it again the other day, and it looks to me that they portray a rather dismal picture. It may not have moved that much. So I guess the question I have to you is, you have a lot of expertise and experience in this field, both in the US and internationally. How would you describe the current status of patient safety globally? And are there any particular trends that we see or issues that you observe in your work?
Right. Yeah, well, I think you're right. The IOM report in 1999 was a major wake-up call. It was the first time, I think, in the States that there'd been a systematic review of the state of patient safety, and the results were pretty shocking. As you just quoted, 100,000 lives a year being lost through medical error. Yeah. And the report subsequently made several recommendations about a potential way out of this. And I think it really galvanized a movement of thinking much more systematically, being much more reflective, using learning as a sort of a central idea, and also bringing in a culture really of less of blame and more openness to the fact that we have a lot to learn as we go along, rather than being judged every time there's an error. This led to a lot of new work. It sparked the 100,000 Lives campaign that IHI mounted as a direct response to the report. And I think a lot of medical systems bought into the idea that you could approach safety in a different way. I think the jury is out really still as to how much impact this all has had over the last 20 years. And David Bates's report certainly was pretty shocking in the sense that they looked back over thousands of records, and what they found was that there was still a lot of harm happening every day, even in a very high-end medical institution in the middle of Boston, which was what they were measuring. The report also showed that there had been progress in certain areas. There are certain parts of our medical care that have become very routine and very reliable, like infection prevention, particularly in ICU settings. And so we've been able to document that there's been some real progress in those areas. I think there clearly is a lot still to be done, as judged by the Bates report, which showed, I think, that they were picking up triggers for errors at about a 25% rate.
Right.
I think the conclusion was that the systematic pursuit of reliable medicine has still not been achieved, even in high-income settings, which have a lot of resources, of a lot of training. And the question is, why is that?
Yes, and it also actually triggers something else. In the email exchange we had leading up to this, you mentioned something that came across as a bit paradoxically to me, I guess, and it was that some of the major advances or improvements in this domain have actually come in the low and medium income countries over the last few years. And I'm sort of, could you unpack that a bit? Why could that be?
Yeah, I think some of it is just the opportunity. So the opportunity for improvement is so great. We've seen very dramatic improvements in areas like maternal mortality and child mortality, and honestly, that the differential between outcomes in maternal mortality and child mortality in low and middle income countries compared to high-income countries is so egregious. So, for instance, in maternal mortality, 95% of all deaths are happening in low-middle-income countries. So it's a rare event in high-income. So part of the progress that we've seen is just because the starting point was just so terrible that it was possible to see really quite substantial improvement over the last 20 to 30 years. But what I was referring to was, and some of the experience that I've had personally, my first big foray into this world was, as I said, going back to South Africa at the height of the AIDS pandemic in the early 2000s, under very difficult circumstances, where there was a lot of denialism in the area about the causes of AIDS and the extent of the problem. And what we were able to do is actually work within the government structures with some very motivated and smart people who bought into this idea that you could, for a very well-defined set of processes of care. So we were working on the prevention of transmission of HIV between mothers and their newborns. And it just so happened that there were new medications that were available, and the clinical trials showed that it was possible to cut the transmission rate down to about 2 or 3%. Wow. And what we were able to show was that you could introduce this type of intervention at scale by learning how to do it, by using data to feed back to the people who were the nurses and the clinics who were screening every pregnant mother coming in, and were able to show that you could screen the mothers for HIV, get them tested, and get them onto drugs in a very reliable way by taking the ideas from the ground about how to do this, turning those into standard protocols, and then showing them back their data to show them that they were improving. That was, to me, a dramatic demonstration of how you could get a system like you have in South Africa in the clinics to follow a protocol where the clinical trials had shown a reduction of transmission down to about 2 or 3%, and yet over a space of about 3-4 years, the entire country managed to get its mother-to-child transmission rates even better than those that were shown in the clinical trials. And to me, that was such a powerful demonstration of really a combination of a few simple factors that allowed a government-run health system to achieve those kinds of dramatic results.
Right.
And if you think about how we struggle to get clinicians to follow evidence-based care in, the rates for giving people the right hypertension medication or the right diabetes medication suggests that, you almost have a 50-50 chance as to whether you're going to get exactly the right evidence-based care. And so we have a lot to learn about how those systems managed to do it. And my experience from working in very many different healthcare systems in the world is that the best chances that you have actually are in well-integrated systems, where there's clear policy, clear training, and good data systems that provide the nurses and the managers with a good line of sight as to what they're doing and how effective their care is.
You're listening to 1 Million Lives, a Laerdal podcast.
I'm almost tempted to sort of flip the question also then, because if we're getting these pockets of good results in low and medium income countries, what are the inhibitors or limiting factors in high income countries? Or is it simply that the results are already fairly good? It's sort of incremental improvements we're looking for? Or what are these factors?
I live in the United States now, and I have experience with the particular issues surrounding the care in the United States, which is very fragmented and the opposite of a well-integrated system. I think there are huge opportunities that apply to both high, middle, and low-income countries for providing more safe and more reliable care. And some of that, I think, is going to come from advances in technology. Well, a lot of it has to do with the line of sight that clinicians have to the care that they're providing. And by that, I mean, how aware are they about how sick their patients are, and how aware are they of the impact of what they're doing on patient care and on any improvements. So for me, there's been a lot of investment in electronic medical records, so in high-income countries. From where I sit and where I observe this in the United States, those electronic medical record systems have been designed primarily to provide information to the payers and the insurers to make sure that they get paid rather than truly than to provide excellent care.
Right.
I think leaders have woken up to the opportunity and the possibilities that these data can be harnessed now to give clinicians a line of sight to their work and to feed back the data and to let them know how they're doing. And we're seeing a lot of progress now in some of the big vendors of the electronic medical record systems, giving good tools back to the clinicians and managers so that they can see what they're doing.
Exactly.
I think that there are other advances that are on the horizon. I think the advent of artificial intelligence, so AI, has, I think, just opened up a whole world of possibilities for us in a very good way. I think people are scared about AI, but I'm personally very excited about what we might be able to do with that. And so I think both from helping clinicians with this terrible burden of documentation and just give them back some time to take care of their patients, and AI can be their assistant.
Co-pilot.
Co-pilot, exactly. Yeah. And AI can be their assistant as well to help guide them through clinical care situations.
Right.
And so I'm hoping at the sort of the clinician's end that there's going to be a lot of help. I think from a manager's viewpoint, and also providing staff with clear sight. So we're using huddles more and more frequently to allow a team of care providers to know what's happening on the ward and to alert them to high-risk patients and what they should be looking out for in terms of who might need special care. I think again, AI can help collate that information and present it in a way, can really give us what we call safety 2, which is being much more proactive about safety, anticipate any issues that might start to crop up.
What could that look like on a very practical level? Let's go back to the huddle. What could it look like for them as a team to act proactively?
Yeah. I think, first of all, what we're starting to see is that these teams are, the data is being collected for them, so that when they arrive on the huddle, they get informed about who's on the ward, who's at particular risk of. So, for instance, they'll get a report about all the patients on the ward who have had catheters in for more than 24 hours, who are much more likely to get infections. Just being alerted, and then going down to the individual nurse level to provide them with a little alert on their phone to say it's time to take that catheter out, act on this now, so that it kind of takes the guesswork out of it, and it also provides people with reminders and prompts.
It makes it so much more reliable, I guess.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Fascinating. You also shared with me almost like a letter, a BMJ opinion, that you wrote back in 2020 together with Kedar Mate, the CEO of IHI. And in it, you describe how the pandemic seemed to cause what you called an explosion of new knowledge. And I'm curious as to what were the sort of outer expressions for that sort of warp speed development that happened?
Well, it was necessity. It was the driver.
Okay.
Like, we suddenly found ourselves in a very difficult situation that nobody had seen before, nobody really anticipated. Well, some people Bill Gates had been warning us, of course, that this pandemic was coming. It was a very interesting example, really, of what could happen.
Right.
And sadly, I think the lessons have almost, to me, sort of been quickly forgotten. And I think if you think about what happened in the pandemic, there was a galvanizing need for everybody to kind of just get really focused on this big problem that we had to solve. So that's sort of the first sort of ingredient, really, of getting people activated and thinking and coming together as if there's a really big problem that we need to solve. And I think that's sort of rule number 1 is spend your time solving big problems and stop worrying about the little stuff. Secondly, we didn't have solutions to the big problem that we needed, and we didn't have time to go through the usual journey of discovery to arrive at good ideas that we would test in a laboratory situation, that we would then go on to doing clinical trials on, and then maybe they would be sort of published sometime, and then we would get to know about them, etc. The years long, the classic studies that says it takes 14 years from a good idea being shown to work to actually everybody using it. And we were moving from good ideas to widespread implementation in days and weeks.
Right.
Okay. If we study what happened there, one of the best examples is proning, which is taking care of a very sick patient who needs to be ventilated on their belly rather than putting them on their back. The use of informal networks to spread this knowledge was one of the great ways in which knowledge was moving. So the movement of knowledge through these informal networks from trusted sources was a very powerful way of moving this knowledge. And I think we need to verify that knowledge, obviously, because not every idea is a good idea, even if people are convinced that it works. I think what we saw in terms of the verification process is that people started to study these ideas in a very rapid fashion.
Right.
And then there was a new phenomenon of pre-publishing your results even before they had gone to peer review, so that people could be alerted to it and could judge the strength of the validity of those ideas even before they went through peer review. And so there were all sorts of new avenues for knowledge transfer and dissemination that started to come out during the pandemic. One of the other really important things that happened was the devolution of power. The hospital administrators were in a position where they couldn't insist on the sort of the formal process that typically happens for a new idea to be tested. So there was much more permission given to try things out. And you could sort of argue the counter to that as well. There could be total chaos and very dangerous things happening. And it turned out that there wasn't actually. People were very responsible with what they were doing, what they were trying, and being very visible and transparent about what they were trying and publishing them through these informal mechanisms. So there was a lot of exciting ways of innovations seeing the light of day very rapidly. Yeah. We seem to have gone back to business as usual.
Have we?
I fear that we have in many ways. I think these informal communication networks are probably still working. I'm sure they are working to some extent. I don't know how you judge that. I just get the sense that we've kind of gone back into our previous, much slower ways of moving new and exciting knowledge.
Yeah. I hope someone writes this up, because I think the way people became creative, they shared. I mean, I think even in the paper you said that those countries that hadn't yet been hit really hard by the wave, they learned from those who this week got hit.
Yes.
I mean, that speed by which knowledge traveled is fascinating, and it speaks to a potential that I think is untapped or very little tapped in daily work.
I mean, I think there were some downsides as well. And I think one of the things that we learned was, and there's been a kind of a reckoning. I mean, there's now inquiries that are happening in all sorts of countries about things that weren't done well, particularly at the policy level. And interestingly, it comes down to candor and transparency. And I think as clinicians and scientists, we're not ready yet to say what we don't know. And to be honest about that and say, listen, we really just don't know about what the very next step is, but this is our best guess.
Right.
And we don't sort of frame it in that way. And I think that would have avoided a lot of the trouble that we're seeing now with some of the inquiries that are happening in the countries.
Yeah, we're always that much wiser afterwards, I guess. But I'm just going to end it off with, you had a quote in your BMG letter. I'm trying to quote you correctly. It said, "We are seeing one of the world's most productive periods for implementation science, putting practical knowledge about the what and how to implement COVID-19 response in the hands of practitioners, managers, and policymakers. Amid the tragedy, the COVID-19 epidemic also leaves us with new ways of learning quickly and efficiently that may forever change the way we discover and deliver better care in the future." That sounds very optimistic. And I'm sort of curious, what spurred you to put this on paper?
Well, I think it's a lot of what we have been talking about. We wrote that in April 2020,
Yes.
and just as things were just kind of the most crazy time of COVID, where we really didn't know what was going on and everyone was trying to answer a lot of questions at once. And I think at the time I did feel like it's not possible that we could ever go back to our more traditional and conservative ways of generating and harvesting and disseminating knowledge. And yet I think two things. One is we have actually gone back, as I said, to a lot of the old ways, but I'm more optimistic really about the way in which improvement and implementation sciences have really had a renaissance or had certainly been adopted at much greater scale. And we've learnt how to do implementation so much better in the last 20 years. And that's accelerated. If you look at the publications coming out of the improvement science and the implementation science world, they are increasing at an exponential rate. People are thinking about better ways to implement the evidence-based knowledge that we rely on to deliver good care. And I think that field is really coming alive. And to me, that is the classic no-do gap. We know what to do, but we don't do it. We don't do it most of the time. And David Bates's article suggests that we're not doing it now.
Right.
And so I think that if you think about the combination of the improved accessibility to data through better reporting mechanisms coming off the electronic medical records, the advent of AI, and also a much more kind of rigorous way of studying the best ways to implement. Now, I think that those factors coming together gives me great hope that we're going to close that no-do gap in the coming years in ways that we've not been able to do previously.
I think actually that's a good way to end this. I have the same hope as you, and I guess the Institute of Healthcare Quality Improvement has it as part of their work to help us get there. We're certainly looking to you guys to help us. This has been very inspiring, Pierre. Thank you so much for your time and to share your insights and thoughts with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
There you have it. From one of the key global experts in the field of healthcare quality and safety, Dr. Pierre Barker. I hope his insights and practical examples left you with food for thought, but also with inspiration to engage and become part of the healthcare quality and safety movement. Few things, it seems to me, can be more timely and important than to move this field forward. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode of the Modern Million Labs podcast. In order not to miss out on future episodes, I recommend you hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And as always, we would love to hear from you. The easiest way to reach us would be by sending an email to podcast@laerdal.com. Take care and bye for now.
You have been listening to a 1 Million Lives podcast by Laerdal. You can find all our podcasts and access any bonus material on laerdal.com/podcast. The views, information, or opinions expressed are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent those of the institution they are affiliated with or of Laerdal Medical. If you have any suggestions for guests or topics we should cover, please send us a message on laerdal.com/podcast. We look forward to hearing from you.
Until the next time, goodbye from the Laerdal podcast team.